Afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this week's learning webinar. My name is Chantel, and I'm going to be your host today as we talk about framing. We're going to look at wall framing and floor framing today, so you get a good understanding on how the software handles both and all the different settings that are combined with them. Following the presentation, I'm going to open up the chat panel so you can type in any questions that you might have on framing. And then following the entire presentation, we're going to email you out a booklet so you can read up about everything we covered today. So let's get started looking at framing. First thing I want to cover is the walls. As you can see on my drawing, I have a little plan drawn. There's a 2x6 stone wall. There's a 2x6 interior load-bearing wall. And at the very front, there's a 2x4 wall with siding on the exterior of it. We're going to look how it handles framing each of those three different types of walls and look at the settings behind them. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to double click on this 2x4 wall to bring up its properties. By double clicking on an element, it'll quickly bring up all the properties of that particular element. So now I'm looking at the properties of that 2x4 wood siding wall. For a wall to frame in the software, it has to be the type that's called framed. If it's any of the other different types, it's not going to frame the wall. The framing is the only one that's going to bring on and show framing inside that wall. And when it's set to framing, to a framed wall, it looks down here at the bottom of the dialog box to see what type of framing member that you've set it to. So it's going to infill that wall with 2x4s because 2x4s is what I have selected here. If I look at the other two walls types that are in my model, the 2x6 stone wall and the 2x6 load-bearing interior wall, they'll both be set to framed as well, and their framing member will be a 2x6. So it's very important to understand that that's where it's getting the framing from. If you have a project that's a mixed project, meaning that it's a remodel project and some of the walls you want to be framed and some of them are existing walls you don't, the existing ones you don't want to frame, you're going to set those to general. And when it's set to general, it won't frame. This framing member will be grayed out. So to be able to, first of all, get framing into the walls, you have to set that to framed, and you have to select a framing member. When it has that framing member set to it, it then will start to frame in that wall. So if I put this model into a 3D view and go up to View, Framing, Display the Framing, it will show me how it's framing those walls. So this wall will be our 2x4 wall, and the rest will be 2x6s. And you can see if I zoom in on them here, the distinction between the 2x4 and the 2x6 wall. It is infilling them with the member that we have selected. But how does it know how to infill that wall with the 2x4s and 2x6s? You can see on the screen, there's 16 inches on center, and I'm just going to put this in a rendered outline view so you can see it a little bit better here and zoom back in. We've got double top plate and a single bottom plate. How does it know how to do that? Up at the very top of the screen, under our settings pull-down menu, you will see building locations. The building locations dialog box not only tells the wall how tall to be in its wall height, but the very last column of information, framing options, will tell it how to frame it. I should put a little disclaimer, if you will, out there too, that if you're using our Pro Architect software, you won't have access to the framing options. They'll be default there, the selections that you have, and you can't alter them. The ability to alter them and to have customized framing options comes with our Building Essentials or Construction Suite software. So I'm going to click on the framing options that are selected for our ground floor locations just by clicking on this little button that's here. That'll bring me into a dialog box that gives me all of my location framing options. So the wall itself dictates what to infill the wall with, a 2x4 or a 2x6, but it's here in our location framing options where it knows how to grab those pieces of lumber and distribute it through the wall. The first one I want to look at is the infill configuration. how is it going to infill the wall with those 2x4s or 2x6s? And you can see that the infill configuration that I have for my ground floor location is 16 inches on center, a double top plate. So it's going to take those studs and distribute them 16 inches on center, put a double top plate above them. If I double click on that option, it'll bring me into a dialog box that allows me to choose a different configuration. So if you wanted to add blocking to the wall as an example, you can say that it's a double top plate, 16 inches on center, and it's blocking halfway up the wall. Or if you needed a pressure treated bottom plate, then you can add that here with the pressure treated bottom plate. So there's all different configurations here. If I scroll down in the list, you can see that there's also steel studs, poles, and I can put them on 24-inch centers. Lots of different options there for distributing the studs throughout the walls so that it knows exactly how you want to frame them. So you simply select the one you want and click OK. And that's how it's going to distribute top plates, bottom plates, studs, and any blocking within that wall. If there's a hole in the wall for a window or a door, it looks at the very top to our span tables. Walls in the catalog are also marked load-bearing and non-load bearing. As a default, the exterior walls in the catalog are automatically set to be a load-bearing wall, and any interior walls are automatically set to be a non-load bearing wall. Unless you're looking at the walls in the catalog, and I'm going to draw your attention over here, that are specifically called out as load-bearing walls, then those interior walls will also be a load-bearing wall as well. Why that matters is that when we're looking at the span tables, you can see that we have a load-bearing span table and a non-load-bearing span table. So any load-bearing walls are going to look at this very first table that I've set to, and any interior or non-load-bearing walls are going to look at this non-load-bearing span table. I'm going to double-click on the span tables, and that will bring us into how it's going to frame those openings. And here again, you can modify how it's going to frame them. So any opening up to 3 feet, it will have its 2x4, 2-ply 2x4 header applied to it. Anything above 3 feet but under 6 feet in my configuration is going to use 2x6s. Anything above the 6 feet but below 10 feet is going to use 2x8s as the header. And then I have a PSL header for anything up to 16 feet that's over the 10 feet. So you can create a span table by adding any new spans that you want or removing any spans that you feel are necessary, or selecting different header configurations here from the list so it frames it exactly the way that you want to. And you can have as many span tables in this list as you want to as well. So I'm just pointing on my ground floor to the 2-ply span table. I could have a ground floor span table, a second floor span table, a basement span table, load bearing, non-load bearing, all different span tables that I want to point to depending on what location I'm on and if it's load bearing or non-load bearing. So you would find the span table that is appropriate for load bearing and one for non-load bearing, and you can point the location to these different span tables. So it'll follow those rules that you've set in those span tables and frame around the openings accordingly. We also have here at the bottom framing rules. So when it starts to lay out that infill of 16 inches on center, it wants to know where to start that infill. So when we're looking at a wall, and I'll just cancel out of here and move this dialog box down a little bit. When we're looking at a wall, if it's horizontally on the screen, how does it know to start either here or from this side here? Or if it's a vertical wall, do I start it here or do I start it from the other side and come down? When we look at the framing rule, you can see it's from bottom and right. So any walls that are horizontal on my screen are going to start the 16 inches on center from the right-hand side of that wall. And any walls that are vertical on my screen are going to start the 16 inches on center from the bottom of those walls. If you need it to start in a different way, you can double click here, and that will reveal the pull down so that you can start any vertical walls from the top and the right for any horizontal walls, or the top and the left, or from where you started originally drawing that wall or where you ended drawing that wall. And that will apply the studs accordingly. This turn stud for intersection lookup table is a way of looking at the different corners. And I'm going to look at the corner configuration separately when we end out here. So I'm just going to cancel out here. So when we look at framing a wall, the wall itself holds the 2x4 or 2x6 or whatever member you want. And then how it's going to be applied is found here in the framing options of the building locations information. But what if you want one wall to be different than the other walls that are on the drawing itself? You can come up here to the View pull-down menu and go to Framing Mode On-Off. And by going to Framing Mode On-Off, that will blanket the drawing and show you all the various walls. The walls themselves, if they're a load-bearing wall, they'll be orange. If it's an opening, you can see that it's this pink color, this rose color, and any corners are blue. So if I need a wall to frame in a different way, then I can click on that one wall, right-click, and then look at its properties. And when I'm looking at the properties of this one wall, what I'm looking at now is how it's framing that one wall. And you can see that it's following the rule to refer to the locations. Whatever I set up in that building locations dialog box, follow that rule and infill the wall with the configuration that I originally chose. Or I can say for this one wall, let's use a custom infill configuration. And then I would hit on this select custom configuration and tell it that I need this one to be 16 inches on center, but I need blocking halfway up. And then I can just click OK and OK again, and you can see the blocking running through the wall. The same was true for any openings. If I left click on this opening right here, and then left click on it and then right click on it and review its properties, it's telling me the same thing. Refer to the infill, refer to the rules you set in the building locations dialog box, and follow the rules that you set there. Otherwise, you can use a custom head, sill, and jamb configuration. And then if I select the configuration, it takes me into the catalog choices of different configurations that I can set when framing around an opening. So I can tell it for this one opening, let's use the 9.5-inch engineered header. And then I'll click OK and OK, and you can see how it reframed around that opening. So anytime you have a custom configuration of how you want to frame it, you can click on those individual walls or openings. When we look at corners, corners are unique on how they're framing a corner. I'm just going to double click on one of the corners. The corners actually learn as you go. So as you draw a model, it's going to frame the corners with some default rules. And then by coming in here, you can tweak those rules so it frames it exactly how you want it to. So right now it's telling me that the default configuration for this corner is a 3-stud energy corner outside. So I can tell it, let's take a look at that and let's edit that 3-stud energy corner outside to see what it is. I'm just going to drop this down into a 2D view so that we can see it. So we have wall A and wall B. And right now I'm going to hide our very top plate. So we're just looking at the studs. So wall A relative to wall B, it's trailing its end to the wall B. So it's coming all the way to the very end of wall A is coming right to the end, and wall B is coming right up against it. And their treatment is square. They've been squared off at that corner. I can offset them. So if I offset them, so if I wanted them to be separated by a distance, I can separate that out from that corner if I want to, or leave it flat. Or I can also flip the end of any studs that are there as well. You can see that wall A has a 3-stud configuration, and wall B here has an N-stud configuration. And I'm telling it that that's my default outside corner that I want to frame with. When you look down here, it's going to apply this framing rule in 3 different ways. It can say a basic match. Basically, any 2 walls that come together that match that same shape, frame them this way. Always any 2 corners that come together have 3-stud corner on one and an N stud on the other. Or I can say it's a moderate match. Any intersection that has the same shape and angle. So it's got to be a 90-degree angle. Frame it this way. Or it's got to be an exact match. It has to be this exact L shape, 90-degree corner on the outside for it to be able to frame it in that configuration. Once you set that rule, anytime you draw walls in the future after that, it's always going to try to grab that moderate match or that basic match that you've set so that it's going to frame it in that configuration. We also have the top plates, and now I'll just display the top plates here and hide the core and our end conditions here. So we can see that wall A is leading into wall B, and that wall B on our top plates is the trailing end here, and that they're square and they're not offset. So you can frame your corners in this configuration, and again, it'll remember that built into how you want those to go, a basic match or a moderate match. Okay, so that's just looking at corners. So corners are a little unique that it looks on every possible corner configuration because they could be many different angles, 90s, 60s, 30s, 45s, and outside corners, inside corners, from the bottom left, from the bottom right, all those different configurations you have, and it's going to learn how you want to frame them and follow those rules that are set. To get it back out of our framing configuration here, I'm going to come back up to the View pull-down menu and go to Framing Mode On Off, and that'll take the wash off all the various walls for us. And I'll just put it back into a rendered view here and then back into 2D. Now back in 2D, now that we understand how the walls are getting all of their framing data, let's look at floors and how we can frame the floor in our model as well. I'm going to use the structural floor tool to do this. The structural floor tool will automatically frame the floor with joists, rim joists, and band joists. It'll automatically put in a subfloor at the same time, and it can also include a sill plate underneath it if it's on a ground floor location and you want to include it. When it's putting in the floor framing, it can apply that floor framing in 2 different ways. It can apply it by the perimeter, the entire perimeter of your house. It can apply it by a single room, or it can be applied by picking points. I always prefer to apply a structural floor by the perimeter. Even in a model like the one I have on my screen that has a garage door, going to have a slab in that room, I'm still going to apply it by the entire perimeter because I can back it out of that room. And this is a handy way, especially when you have a large project that you're dealing with, of making sure that you get all of your band joists, rim joists in the right areas, instead of doing it by room, where each room is going to be a separate floor container, if you will, with its own rim joist running around it and the floor joist running. If you do it around the entire perimeter, the rim joist will wrap itself around the perimeter, and then it's going to infill inside that with your floor joist. But then we can back areas away, like I'm going to show you, out of the garage areas. So I'm going to use structural floor by perimeter. Over in the catalog panel to the right, it'll show me my floor systems that are predefined. I'm going to click on the 2x10 floor system and then right click on it in the catalog and choose Edit Element. So to bring up all of the information pertaining to that 2x10 floor system. In here, we spell out all of the different components that are going to make up that floor. and their parameters to the right, and you get a preview of what it's going to look like to the very far right. So the first thing I'm looking at are general properties. So it's going to tell me that the joist direction is 90 degrees. In the software, 0 degrees is to the right of the screen, 90 degrees is to the top, 180 is to the left, and 270 is at the bottom of your screen. So when we're looking at a joist direction of 90 degrees, it means the floor joists are going to span in this direction up and down on my screen. If I change that to 0, then there's going to span left to right on my screen. So you can change that joist direction depending on how you want them to be laid out in your project. The joist spacing, so once it lays them out 90 degrees up and down my screen, it's going to space them out 16 inches on center. If it comes across a beam, it's going to stagger across the beam, meaning if my joist come across a beam here and they're going to span across it, and I tell it that this is a break at beam point, which I'll show you how to do, it's going to lay out my first beam and come across it by 1 foot, so this 1 foot overlap, and then my next is going to tie one in right beside it, and it's going to overlap it by a foot. So all of my joists coming down are going to follow that configuration of overlapping by 1 foot. If I had that beam in and I told it to break my joist of the beam, my other option is to hold back. And if you hold back, instead of doing the stagger, what it's going to do instead is it's going to hold back the joist at that beam. So my joists are going to come along in a configuration stopping at that beam instead. You can, if I put a distance to the hold back, that means it's going to hold it back by a foot. So the joist is actually going to start 1 foot away from the center line of that beam. So if that beam is 2 feet thick, it's going to come back to the right point to hold it right at the edge of it. So always know the thickness of that beam, and that's going to be your hold back distance here if you chose hold back instead. If I click on sheathing here on the left-hand component list, in the middle parameters, I can see that yes, it is including some sheathing, and it's going to be some 3/4 inch OSB. If I click on that, it'll take me back to my catalog, so I can choose something different if I choose. I can also select my joist, what size it's going to be, and label it as a joist. My sill plate, so if this is on a ground floor location, I can say yes, include the sill plate, or I can delete that out as well if it's going to be on a second floor location or a location where I don't need the sill plate. I can also have band joists around the perimeter, perpendicular to my joist, and rim joists that are going to run parallel to my joist as well. And if I cut a hole into the opening, into the floor itself, it's going to want to know how to frame around that opening, and I'm telling it to use some 2x10s. So all of this is in the background of the floor itself, so when I apply it, it's going to give all of those various members and components that I see here on the left, and following the general property parameters that I set forth as well. I'm just going to hit cancel there. I'm going to grab that 2x10 floor system out of my catalog and move it into my building. Because I told it to apply the structural floor by the perimeter, it's going to map out the entire perimeter of my building and highlight it in blue so I can see where it's going to outline my floor. If I'm happy with that, I just left click and my joists will be applied. I have them currently turned off, so I'm going to visit this view filter icon at the bottom of the screen, and I'm going to hit the plus sign beside floors and turn on the structural floor framing so I can see it. Now I can see those floor joists coming through. If I needed to make any changes to that, like I said, I want to back it out of my garage area, and I want to add a beam right in here and overlap the floor joists in that area. If I want to do things like that, I need to select the structural floor. I'm going to left click on this 2x6 stone wall. The floor itself has the same edge as our wall, so they're overlapping. So to be able to select the floor, I'm going to cycle select through the options that are also ending with this wall. So once I select this wall, I'm going to hold down the Shift key on my keyboard and scroll with the scroll wheel on my mouse. And as I do that, you can see that it's selecting different things. And I'm going to draw your attention down to the lower left corner of the screen where you can see that it's constantly changing some text down there. It's saying right now, it's saying one object selected, the 3/4 inch OSB. So it's saying you've selected just the OSB here. It's got the same edge as that wall. If I scroll again, it's saying right now you've got one object selected. It's the primary object. It's a 2x10 floor system with 3/4 inch OSB, my entire structural floor system. That's what I want to select right now. So I can release my Shift key and stop scrolling because it's found the item that I want. When I have that entire structural floor system selected, what I want to tell it is that I want to move this edge up here at the top down to this wall. You'll notice all of the red arrows pointing to the edges of this structural floor system. Each edge is highlighted by that red arrow. At the end of that red arrow, there's a blue square. It's called a grip. And that grip is right on the edge of that floor edge. So I'm going to move my cursor onto that blue square on the edge that I want to move. And as I move my cursor along and onto that blue grip, you'll notice my cursor changes to a move indicator. Now by just holding down the left mouse button, I can move my cursor to a new edge. I'm telling it to come in line with the other edges right here and release. And that will remove the structural floor from my garage. Now I also need to tell it that I want to be putting in a bearing line at this point. There'll be a beam underneath it on my foundation location. So I'm going to break the floor joist at that point. With the structural floor system still selected, I still see those red arrows. I'm going to right click, and when I right click, it brings up options that I have for that structural floor. In here, I'm going to go down to the structural floor option and choose insert a bearing line. Inserting a bearing line is basically drawing a line where you're going to have a beam, and it tells the structural floor to break it at that point and overlap or hold back, depending on the setting that you had, your floor joist. So I'm going to insert a bearing line. I just left click where I want to start that bearing line, move my cursor, and left click again where I want to stop that bearing line. And as soon as I do that, the floor joists that overlap that line automatically recognize that they're going over top of a bearing line, and they'll follow the rules that I set up in the properties of this structural floor to overlap a bearing line by 1 foot, because I had that stagger option chosen. If you need to change any of the properties of the floor now that you have it inserted, you can also right-click with it selected and look at the properties to remind yourself of the properties that you set. So if 1 foot overlap was too much, you can change that to 6 inches instead. And when I click OK, you can see that it changes that automatically to just 6 inches. So that structural floor is interactive. I can modify the settings of it, and it will update and regenerate the floor for me. I can move its edges, and it'll automatically respond to that and reframe the floor for me as well. So it's a very powerful tool to be able to frame the floor. That tool is available in Building Essentials and Construction Suite. If you have Pro Architect, you'll have to use instead our floor tool instead of the structural floor tool. And when I look at the floors that are available here, if I just right click on any of these floors, you do have the ability to set it to a framed floor, and you can specify basic framing. So I can tell it what type of joists I'm using, what type of rim joists, and if I put a hole in it, what type of opening header it's going to frame around. And it will frame that floor, but it doesn't have the same type of modification tools as our structural floor tool. It can't automatically put in a sill plate at the same time. I can't individually select the floor joists and modify them if I need to. It doesn't have the insert a bearing line option or the ability to reframe and move edges like I did with this particular floor. So you can frame with Pro Architect and put in a basic framing. You just don't have the advanced structural floor tool. A lot of information. Let me recap quickly before we get into our questions and answer time with the framing webinar. First thing we looked at are the walls. I'm going to double click on this wall. To be able to have framing show up into a wall, it has to have framed selected, and you have to have a framing member selected down here. Also, while I'm in this dialog box, I'm going to scroll down to show you the load bearing versus non-load bearing that we looked at when we were looking in the building locations. Automatic means that if it's an exterior wall, it's automatically going to be framed as a load bearing. If it's an interior wall, it's automatically going to be framed as a non-load bearing. But you can select yes, frame it as load bearing, or no, frame it as non-load bearing if you have an individual wall that you need to switch that out. Once we tell that a wall that it's going to be a framed wall, then it comes up here to the building locations dialog box, and it follows the rule that you set in here. In here, on the last column of information is our framing options. This is where it finds out how you want to infill that wall with framing members. This is where it finds out when you infill that wall, where do you start that 16 inches on center with your studs, from the bottom of a vertical wall, from the right of a horizontal wall, or if there's any openings in the wall, how is it going to frame through those openings? And it looks at the span tables that we set in here and follows the rules that you have in that span table, so it knows how to frame at different spans. Once you have that framing in, if you want to make any changes to individual walls or openings, I popped this into a 3D view so I can go up here to View Framing Mode On Off. You can select the individual walls, right-click, and look at their properties to tell it to use a custom infill if you want to frame it in some other manner, and it will follow the rules that you set for that wall. Or you can do the same thing for openings, and you can also custom frame the intersections. To get back out of that framing mode, it's View Framing Mode On Off. We also inserted a structural floor. We did it by perimeter, and I mentioned that I like doing it by perimeter because we have the ability to back it out of certain areas and split the framing in other areas so that we can have a bearing line come through, or even split it entirely. It's a great way of putting in the framing for the walls. And I'm just going to turn back on now that structural floor framing so we can see the joist coming through. Once you insert the framing, if you do need to change it, we talked about cycle selecting. That's holding down your shift key and moving the scroll wheel on your mouse to be able to select different elements. And once you have the element that you want selected, you can make the changes to it like we did by inserting a bearing line or looking at the properties of the entire structural floor and changing the bearing or the overlap here to 6 inches. Another nice thing about the structural floor tool is the ability to back it out of areas like we did with the garage floor. I want to spend the rest of our time together today on any questions that you might have about framing floors and walls. The GoToMeeting console that's on the right-hand side of your screen allows you to type in any questions that you might have about framing. And then I'll be able to address those live here during our class. I've also recorded today's class, and we will be putting that up to our YouTube channel so that you'll be able to watch it afterwards as well if you want to have another look at everything that I covered over today. So let's get to your questions. Lots of them today. How would you frame for the garage walls that will be taller by the depth of the floor joist? Great question. So when we're looking at this model in a 3D view, and these walls are going to be potentially 1 foot taller because our garage floor is going to be sitting down lower because it's going to come right down to the slab. The first thing I would do to indicate that is to select those garage walls. So let me tilt this down a little bit so we can see this happening. Holding down my shift key, I'm going to select all 3 walls. And I'm going to right click first of all and tell them to elevate down. They're going to sit down a foot lower than my main floor walls because they're not sitting up on top of those floor joists. They're sitting right down on my slab instead. So first thing I tell them is to sit down a foot lower. Right click and elevate allows me to elevate them down. I'm telling it -1 foot, lower them by a foot. When I hit apply and OK, they're sitting down now a foot lower. And if we look at that in a 3D view, you can see that that lowered it from the top. Now I need to tell them to sit up 1 foot taller. So I right click again, look at their properties, and this time when I click properties, I'm going to go to their top and bottom tab. I'm going to tell them that they need to be taller. Instead of 9-foot walls, these ones need to be 10-foot walls. And I click OK. And now they're the same top as my main walls, but they're actually 1 foot taller. When it goes to frame those walls, it will frame them accordingly. So if we look at the view, framing, display the framing, I'm getting those 1 foot taller walls in those locations, and you can see that framing it up and bringing it to the underside of those joists, not on top of them. Okay, great question. Next question. Can you change an interior wall from a non-load bearing to a bearing wall within the drawing? Yes, you can. So I'm going to take our model here out of framing. So I'm going to say framing, display all but the framing. And I'll put it back into a 2D view. If I select this interior wall, I can right click and look at its properties. Under the properties of this interior wall, right now it's telling me that it's a load bearing wall in its description. And if I scroll down, you can see frame as load bearing has been set to yes. I could simply set that to no. And when I set that to no, it will then frame any openings following my non-load bearing span table instead. So yes, you can change a wall after you've drawn it to follow a different rule. Okay, next question. Can you show a cutout, for example, for stairs? Yes. So I'm going to turn back on my structural floor, turning its visibility back on. And when I've got that on, I'm just going to scroll through my different selections here. And when I get that whole entire structural floor system selected after my scrolling, if I right click here, one of the options I have is to cut an opening. You want to make sure you have the structural floor selected with the red arrows there to cut the opening. Because if you just select the sheathing as an example, you're just cutting through the sheathing. So make sure it's the entire floor that you're cutting through. And then I'll say cut opening. And then I would show it where, if there was a staircase as an example, where I'm cutting through. So I'm just going to come through and show it my opening, right click, and tell it I'm finished. And then from there, it cuts the opening, and that opening on the sides gets a 2 by 10. If you want that to be doubled up here, you can select that member, that 2 by 10, right click, and tell it you want to duplicate it. And then I can have two 2 by 10s. So everything here, all these members are individual members, and I can tell it to duplicate them or to erase any that I wouldn't want to have, so I can send them through. And I'm just going to move that into place there. There. And then for the 2 by 10s, I can have them span out to my next floor joist here if I wanted to do some extra bearing there, or take this one, what I'm right up against, and duplicate it. So I know that I've got that opening all nicely framed around. Coming up a little bit here. So I can expand any of these, lengthen them by just putting my cursor over there, hovering over their endpoint, and then holding down that leftmost button and dragging them out. So if I need to even further customize how I'm framing around that, I can do that as well. A great question. Next question. What is the best way to frame a corner that's shaped like a Y? So we've got a couple intersections coming in together, and it's coming out like a Y. So let's draw that out here. So I'm just going to, with my wall tool, I'm going to grab maybe an interior 2x4 wall, and I'm going to draw one line coming up here. And then I'm going to turn on my angle snap and turn off ortho so I can come up into a corner configuration here that's coming up on an angle. And so 135 coming across and then coming down into my corner here. So I've got this Y intersection happening here. So when I go to frame that, view framing, display the framing, if I go into my view framing mode on off, I can click on that and tell it I need to create a custom configuration. I've never framed a Y corner before. Let's add one in. So now it recognizes, and I'm just going to come in here and view as 2D, wall C, B, and A. And I'm just going to turn off the very top plates and make sure we've got that on. So wall A, in relative to wall B, we're going to make it the leading wall. And wall B, relative to wall A, we're going to make it the trailing wall. Wall C, in relative to wall A, we'll make that our, let's make that, we can make that our miter here. Let's miter A and B. So wall B relative to wall A, let's make that a miter as well. And then A is going to be our trailing. So we could bring it in that kind of configuration like that. And the same with the top plates, wall A relative to wall B. Let's take a look at our top plates instead. And we can wall B to A and C to A. We can make A our trailing wall, and then these two can miter into it. So we could do a configuration like that. And then for anything that's a moderate match to that, we can do that. And then I can say that these are all just one end stud, if that's the way I want them to frame. So I can display the core, display our end studs here for our configurations. And for wall A, we can also have wall A have an offset there if I want to bring that down, or wall B and B to A, I can give it an offset if I wanted that stud to come out slightly from that corner and how I want it to display. So depending on how you want to frame it, if it doesn't had a Y intersection before, it doesn't know how to frame it, and you can choose how these are all going to come together and call this my corner type Y. and then it'll follow my Y rules on when it goes to frame that corner. Another good question. How would you add blocking between joists when you added the bearing beam? So if I wanted to add in any blocking between those are going to be separate members. So let me just get out of our framing mode here and turn on again our floor framing. The floor framing gets turned off when I go into that framing mode because it only wants to show you wall framing. That's why I'm continuously going back and turning it off. So at this point, what if I wanted to add blocking through the walls, through the floor framing here, and just rows of blocking? I would use my member command for that. So I could say members, grab a 2x4 member or 2x6 or whatever I'm going to be using for my blocking. And when I have that member, I'm going to tell it where it's going to start and stop. Here's the base height here. So it's going to go at 0 for this floor. And then I would just say I could put a row of blocking coming from maybe from here to here, repeat, here to here, repeat, and then just keep repeating it along there. Or I'm going to repeat one here. I can tell it to put one in from here to here. And if this is something I'd want to repeat up the wall itself and across, I can select it, right-click, and choose Array. And Array allows you to make multiple copies. So I could say how many rows of them do I need, and rows are coming across, up and down my screen. So I'm going to say, let's make 8 rows. Number of columns, I want it to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 columns. So it goes in between each row here. Distance between the rows, let's just say 3 feet. Distance between the columns, let's say 16 inches. So when I click OK, what it's going to do is copy this up 3 feet, 3 feet, 3 feet, and copy it across 16 inches, 16 inches, 16 inches. And it's going to go from center line to center line for that. So I just click OK. And then you can see how that all got copied up and across for that as well. So that would be a quick way of adding blocking, is to array it. So if it's going to be throughout the entire model on a set distance away from each other, use array. Put in one piece, array it to the rest of the pieces. Okay, let's go to our next question. Can you show how to label the beam size or header size? For example, 2 2x10s. Yep, that's just using text. So when I'm in here and I have a label that I want to put across my opening, that string of text is just text. Tools, text, text. And I'm going to tell it that I want just a dimension style text. And I'm going to say 2 2x10 header. And then I can say multiple text insert. So if I have more text to put in, it'll bring this back up again. So I can say 2 2x10 header here. The dialog box will open back up, and I can say 2 2x8 header. I'm going to uncheck that this time, and I can put that over on this opening down here that I want it there. So I could label it that way. Alternatively, what you could also do is take advantage of our labels. So when I'm looking at a opening itself and looking at its properties, under the quantity tab, so I selected that door, right-click, look at its properties, and went to the quantity tab. Here under the quantity tab, I can tell it that I want the mark to be a custom mark. So what custom mark allows me to do is every time I put in this 9x7 garage door, I could tell it to put in 2 2x10 header. And when I click OK, that will add that in there. And I've got a large string of text set for that, but you get the point that that can be put in there as your text. You can use the text to call out that this is a 60-inch patio door, or you can use it, if it's more helpful, to be the header size that's going to be going over that instead. So either way is valid, just using text, or every opening under their properties, under the quantity tab, can have a mark. And that mark can be a custom mark. And that, if you set it to custom, it allows for things like that. So that every time you put in that door in the future, it's always going to be putting in that custom mark for you. And that'll save you some time as well. Great question. Next one. Is there a way to show a metal hanger to indicate that it is a flush beam? Yes, so let me just undo a lot of this work I did here with all of that blocking there. And undo all of that blocking. I'm going to show again our structural floor framing on. And let me just grab our structural floor. I might have got rid of it by undoing too much here. I think I may have erased our structural floor. So let me just put that on for just a second here. I'm going to grab our structural floor and put it back in again because I have taken it off and I need to put that back on again. So just bear with me for a second here while I get that put back on again. And then what I'm going to show you once I get that structural floor back in is how we can take that floor and do a floor joist for it as well. Okay, so I've got my structural floor back in. I've got it selected again. I'm going to right-click to look at its properties and tell it that instead of stagger, we want to hold back and click OK. And now we've got them held back at this beam instead. And what I can do then is we do have floor joists as part of our accessories. So just give me a second where I find them in our catalog here. They are under our equipment, I believe, structures, hardware, joist hangers. So if you go to under the interiors tab to equipment, you'll see a selection of different joist hangers. And those joist hangers, there's different sizes here, depending if you've got a double or a single, can be placed in. So I'm just going to place one in here, give it a quick turn so it's got the right orientation here. And then that can be done the same way. So I can array these across. So I know I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of them. Right click, array. Those are coming across as columns. So I have one row. I only want one of them. I don't need to go up and down, but I have 6 columns. And the distance between the columns is 16 inches. And click OK. And they're all copied across. So yes, you can put in the floor joist hangers and show them in there as well by finding one of the ones that we've put in here and arraying them across. Let's go to our next one. How do you show a double joist, for example, under kit island for weight of countertop? All of the joists that it puts in are individual members. So each one of these, if I select one, I can right click and choose duplicate. and then double it up. And that is another 2x10 floor joist in there. So anywhere you have to double them up, select the member that's there, right-click, and duplicate. And that will allow you to show them doubled up. Okay, next question. Instead of blocking, what if it's bridging? Bridging would be the same thing. You would just do a member again, but when you're running the member, instead of coming across like that, you would just go in the different direction. So when I say member, I would come down on an angle instead. So if whatever angle you're going to have for your for that, and then you would just show it on the angle going through. That seems to be all of the questions that were up there. Excellent questions. I'm going to hold that chat line for one further moment, just in case somebody else comes up with a question that they want to ask. Otherwise, I did record today's class. I will be uploading that to our YouTube channel and putting a link to it on our website. If you don't know where to find the links to the YouTube videos on our website, if you go up to www.cadsoft.com, the quickest way to find them is to scroll down to the very bottom of our main page, and in there you'll see events and training. That'll bring you up to our training calendar where you can always register for our various training classes that we have. And beside that calendar where you see today's class is on framing, you'll see webinar archive. If you click on that archive, that will take you to the site where you can look at all of the various classes that we've had in the past and click on any one that you want to see. There doesn't seem to be any other questions that are up there. So I want to thank everybody for joining us for today's class. I hope you learned a little bit about framing walls and floors and that you can use that in your work. Thanks for everybody for joining us today. I hope you have a great week. Thanks and bye-bye.